Hi, this is our lecture on movements for liberation. So in the wake of the African American civil rights movement's victories, especially in 1964 and 1965, other communities of Americans now had a successful model, albeit one that was still evolving, for creating mass organizations and pursuing more rights. These movements were sometimes populist appeals to the moral consciences of other Americans for employment opportunities and respect, and were sometimes relatively elite litigation strategies aimed at removing bars to discrimination. Changes in legislation created new opportunities to frame legal goals. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act finally dropped the racial and ethnic quota system from the 1924 National Origins Act, which we looked at earlier this semester. Instead, it established one uniform quota upon immigration from any particular nation. This meant that it was now a lot easier to immigrate to the U.S. from a non-European country, and increasingly numbers of immigrants arrived from Mexico, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. Immigrants from Asia were disproportionately trained in professions in which employers were seeking employees, especially in technical and medical fields. These immigrants gained a reputation as being a model minority because of their greater levels of education and affluence than the general population. But this designation was not just complimentary, but also problematic for two reasons. First, it obscured the troubling experience of refugees, a subset of Asian American immigrants, often from Cambodia or Laos, and often dislocated because of U.S. anti-communist endeavors in Asia. Second, the labeling of Asian Americans as a model minority implied that there must be something wrong with the cultures of Latinos and African Americans, rather than illuminating the different ways in which American racism operated. There wasn't much mass organization in the Asian American community of the 1960s, but in the 1970s, new changes began to emerge as a generation of college-educated students fought for what they called yellow power by illuminating the problem of sweatshop labor, calling for increased curriculum diversity, and petitioning against stereotypical images on media. The immigrants who arrived from Latin America and the Caribbean were more frequently unskilled, and many became agricultural workers. They were essentially gathering together what we've described over the semester as a long, ongoing movement of people from South America and Mexico into the United States. Remember that there's always people who are constantly coming in during that time and gradually moving to middle-class status. But there's always new immigrants that are also coming in. So Latino immigration doesn't have the same wave structure that immigration from other places does. The creation of the United Farm Workers of America, initially called the National Farm Workers Association, was another example of how organized labor and identity politics could merge to advance the interests of a particular group. Cesar Chavez emerged as the union's head, and the UFWA organized massive numbers of agricultural workers to picket grape growers, asking for higher wages, better working conditions, including toilets and less pesticides, and greater job security. The average farm laborer in 1965 earned about $1,350 per year. And greater job security would mean that the children of farm workers could attend the same school year after year, rather than being shuttled from one institution to another every time their parents had to follow employment. The UFWA provided workers with a credit union, insurance, and other services, such as translation and assistance getting driver's licenses. The 1965 strike on grape growers spilled over into asking consumers to boycott the product, and the boycott was ultimately successful, but it lasted 5 years. For women, an obscure and, many have speculated joking, phrase in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 created a legal grounds for lawsuits against discriminatory employment practices. The emerging women's rights movement challenged employers whose policies automatically fired women at a certain age or women who got married, who listed open positions in separate men's and women's columns, like you see here, or who systematically refused to promote female employees. Not yet at stake were questions about state laws prohibiting women from serving on juries, or regulations from credit card companies that made husbands the real cardholders and left women with no credit history, or for that matter, academic policies that facilitated parallel grading for male and female students. Again, the emerging women's rights movement had origins in labor organization. For example, Betty Friedan, whose texts we're reading for today, had worked in labor organization for several years. The presentation of herself as a domestic housewife and feminine mystique left this part out, instead creating a myth of spontaneous consciousness raising. The women's rights movement also had a direct, not just inspirational, roots in the civil rights movement. Many of the civil rights movement leaders, such as Casey Hayden and Mary King, were active in SNCC, and some historians have suggested that it was the simultaneous exposure to so much talk about liberation and the experience of being kept in a subordinate organizational role, in other words, being asked to get the coffee, that ignited the women's movement. Okay, at this point you should go ahead and pause the lecture and head over to the two discussion questions about Betty Friedan's feminine mystique, which are on the webpage. The ERA had first been advocated by women's rights leaders in the 1920s, but the campaign was reawakened when Congress passed the ERA in 1972 and sent it to the states for ratification. The ERA was needed, advocates argued, because the courts had not interpreted the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to overcome state and local discriminatory practices. 33 states approved the amendment by 1974, but opposition stiffened under the leadership of conservative Phyllis Schlafly, and the amendment stalled. There's a new show coming out that you might want to look at. So the actual Phyllis Schlafly is on the left, but there you can see Cate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly now. Even with an extended ratification window of 1982, the amendment would be 3 states short of ratification. Part of the conservative opposition was rooted in resistance to the women's movement beyond domesticity, but part of it was also just a fear about eliminating protective legislation, and part of it was just silly, like a fear that there would suddenly be no privacy anywhere for women, or that the Girl Scouts would be forced to take boys into the Girl Scouts, or that there'd be no alimony payments if your husband divorced you. So what I want you to do now is take a look at the two letters, or at letter number 2 and the other discussion question that are prompted on the course page. So please go over there and give some responses to the kind of letters that the Girl Scouts of America received. Gender consciousness from the women's movement, in turn, ignited an organized gay rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. I just wanted to give you a quick preview. This is footage from the Stonewall riots in 1969, if these aren't a familiar incident, about how police harassment was basically responded to by gay men who chased off the police and then largely got arrested. This is usually seen as the kickstart of the gay rights movement, even though there was really a burgeoning movement that existed before that. So for the upcoming lecture, it's going to be by Professor Stuart Winter, who's an expert in the field of gay history, especially in the city of Chicago. And I want you to go ahead and listen to that when the syllabus gives you that instruction. But just a preview, just think about how these things are all connected.